colonies out of business. So even back then, this is a tactic within a broader strategic campaign. Moving forward about a century or 2 centuries, boycotts were a very important part of the historic civil rights movement in the US. Just a few examples. Most people know about the Montgomery bus boycotts, which lasted over a year and ended with a Supreme Court ruling to desegregate transportation, which had an effect all over this country and really was inspired a lot of people that the civil rights movement could have these victories and could reach their ultimate goal. Not many people know about the Baton Rouge bus boycott, which happened earlier because they did not win with total desegregation. They set intermediate term goals, and in Baton Rouge, their goal wasn't to desegregate the bus. Their goal was simply to get more seats for black people on the bus. Because previously they only had a very small section, and they won their boycott after 8 days with the agreement that they would fill the whole bus up, whites in front, blacks in back, but black people could have as many seats as they wanted until they hit the white people in the front. So a partial victory, but it was something that they planned for, and I think that's important. If we wait for the ultimate victory, there's a big chance of burnout, so it's good to have these intermediate goals as well. There are also several school boycotts during the civil rights movement, where basically students refused to go to schools that, while they may have been integrated, were not really equal. Maybe they were integrated on the face of things, for instance in Chicago, but the schools that black students ended up going to were inevitably more poorly resourced, and teachers weren't getting support, students weren't getting support. So they had these boycotts that were normally just a day or two, where folks just wouldn't go to school to show their discontent with that system. I don't know if anyone here remembers the American Football League. It was not around that long, but they were part of a very early sports boycott. There was a team in New Orleans, and they were set to host the All-Star game, and cab drivers refused to take black players to their hotels and to the game. Hoteliers, I don't know, what do you call people who own hotels? They were refusing to give rooms. Hotel tycoons. They were refusing to give rooms to the black players, and so the AFL decided they were not going to have the All-Star game in New Orleans, and they had it in Houston, and they boycotted the entire city of New Orleans until their demise and being sucked into the NFL. There were also a lot of retail boycotts, particularly with gas stations, because a lot of gas stations did not allow black people to use the restrooms. So there was this big campaign that started in Mississippi that was basically just distributing bumper stickers that said, if you can't use the restroom, don't buy your gas there. Pretty simple concept, but again, it sort of laid this foundation for civil rights and for racial equality using boycott as a strategy. Moving on with the South African analogy, you're going to hear a lot about the relationship between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid in the next 2 days. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the details of the South African BDS movement. Apartheid in South Africa was officially established the same year as the State of Israel, which is kind of an interesting fact. And the very first call for BDS as a strategy came from the African National Congress in the early 1950s. The first boycott that I could find any evidence of was called the May Day Stay Away in 1950, and that was black South Africans and colored South Africans, which was a legally defined term at that time, basically declared a general strike and wouldn't go to work for a day. And that was sort of like the first time that they really flexed their muscle using this strategy. They also used the concept of bus boycotts. In the late 50s through the 70s, with the rise of the Black consciousness movement, there were a lot of connections made between the US civil rights movement and struggles in Africa for freedom and liberation. And that's something that's really important, I think, just to show that, no one campaign, no one movement stands on its own. That there's always these connections. And for me, not being of Palestinian heritage, not being of Jewish heritage, I'm just a boring white chick who happens to believe in human rights. And I get harassed a lot for like, well, why do you care about this? You're not Arab, you're not Jewish, like why, this isn't your problem. But it is my problem, because I believe in human rights, and I believe that none of us are really liberated until all of us are liberated. So remembering that, the Irish Land War, the civil rights movement in the U.S., the farm worker justice movement in the U.S., the South African anti-apartheid movement, and the Palestinian liberation movement are really part of the same, much bigger project. So keep that in mind. Successful movements in the past have kept that in mind, and that's why they won. In 1959, the African National Congress officially made their appeal for international boycott, so I guess you could say that's like their equivalent of the 2005 Palestinian call for BDS. And then there are also other kinds of boycotts within South Africa, such as school boycotts. School boycotts were a really big deal because Black children in South African were not allowed to be taught in their own languages, they were not allowed to be taught about their own culture, much like Palestinians living in Israel. This actually came from the students themselves rather than older people telling them what to do. They just refused to participate in that system. So a lot of schools were closed, a lot of schools were forcibly kept open by the military. This photo up here shows students, and others at what came to be known as the Sharpeville Massacre, which basically was the South African security forces overreacting dramatically to a school boycott in in Sharptown, or oh no, I'm sorry, in Soweto. I lied, but the caption should be right. And there are also consumer boycotts within Africa, or within South Africa. Black people refusing to participate in white establishments. Then we moved to the solidarity campaigns with South Africans, which, okay, that does kind of look good. Anyway, there were a whole variety of kinds of boycotts that were going on. Sports boycotts, as somebody mentioned yesterday, were a huge deal because that was like South Africa's big thing. Like they had great sports teams. But starting in 1956, they were kicked out of the International Table Tennis Federation. What a watershed event that turned out to be. In 1964, they stepped it up a notch and they lost their membership in FIFA, which, outside of this country is like a huge deal. In 1964 and 1968, they were boycotted by the International Olympic Committee, and then in 1972, the International Olympic Committee officially barred South Africa until the end of apartheid. There was also a lot of issues with the South African national rugby team, which was, of course, a segregated team. It was all white. And other international rugby teams, wouldn't play them. They talked a lot of shit, basically. And rugby actually became a huge part of the reunification process, which you can all learn about when Morgan Freeman's new movie comes out. South Africa was also boycotted from the Commonwealth Games, which doesn't really apply to anyone here, but if you're part of a country that used to belong to the British Empire, it's kind of a huge deal. Their cricket teams were also boycotted, which who knows what cricket is, right? Consumer boycott happened around the world, starting in 1959 with European solidarity groups boycotting fruit and tobacco coming from South Africa.